Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Fortified Life podcast, where we are passionate about developing a dependency on Jesus in the marketplace. I'm your host, Jason Davis, aka Mr. Fortify. Every week, we have the opportunity to bring on authors, speakers, coaches, all sorts of people who are passionate about bringing God back in business. And it's no different this week. And I got to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, our guest today, I'm very excited. I've been following him for some time, and God has definitely graced him with a lot of gifts to do a lot of things, and he is impacting lots of people. Before I bring him on, let me introduce him to you. Grant Baldwin. He is the founder of Speaker Lab. He is the host of the Speaker Lab podcast, published author as well. We'll get to his book a little bit later. But, folks, welcome to the Fortified Life, Grant Baldwin. Grant, how's it going?
Doing well, man. Thanks for letting me hang out with you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Grant, when people look at your bio and everything you're involved in, there's always that question that comes up. How did you get into what you're doing? I don't think people just kind of fall into coaching, training, and empowering speakers.
Yeah. Yeah. So way back in the day, if we go back in the DeLorean, I in high school was really involved with my local church, and my youth pastor had a big impact on my life. And for the longest time, I was like, I want to do that. I want to be a youth pastor. I kind of felt like if I could make the kind of difference in others' lives that he made in my life, like that seemed really, gratifying, fulfilling, rewarding. And so that was kind of the path I was on. Went to Bible college and became a youth pastor at a local church. And as a youth pastor, there were, parts of it I liked, parts of it I didn't like, but one thing I really enjoyed was speaking, and speaking was one of those things I felt like I was good at. Was doing, Wednesday nights with students, was doing Sunday mornings with students, was every so often doing Sunday mornings, in big church as the Plan B substitute. And I just felt like, like, hey, there's something here. I really enjoy this. Would like to do more of it. And so, when my wife was pregnant with our first child, there's nothing like bringing a kid into the world that just causes you to question everything. You're just like, all right, what am I doing with my life? You and I were just talking about this a little bit offline,
Yeah.
and like how it's just a game changer, right? And so, I decided like, okay, if I wasn't going to be a youth pastor, like I'm really interested in speaking, but this was again 18, 19 years ago or so. At the time, there were really no books or resources or tools or podcasts or just anything to help figure out like, how do you like become a speaker? Like it didn't feel like there was a real clear blueprint for anything. And so I found myself like emailing other speakers, harassing other speakers, stalking other speakers, kind of pick your brain sort of stuff, and like learning some stuff here and there. A lot of speakers were super generous and kind. I started booking a couple gigs here and there and eventually became a full-time speaker. And I was doing 60, 70 gigs a year all over primarily the US, and loved it. It was a lot of fun. And then I found myself kind of on the receiving end of that, where a lot of people were asking me like, hey, you're a speaker. That's kind of cool. How do I do that? How do you find gigs, and what do you speak about, and how much do you charge, and who hires speakers, and like, how does this work? And so started doing some coaching training around that, and that evolved into the Speaker Lab. And so the Speaker Lab is a training company, and we do training and coaching for speakers, teaching primarily the business of speaking. How do you find and book
Mm,
paid speaking engagements? And so, yeah, that's the core of what we do today. And I spend my days helping speakers spread their message with the world.
wow. Grant, there's a, a couple things that stick out there. One, transition. Obviously, as human beings, nobody likes change. But so, Grant, especially with your background, and I can only, at least I could be wrong, I can only think of a handful where they're kind of in the faith space first, and then they go into the
Yeah.
business world where we usually see the opposite. They leave the business world to kind of come into ministry.
Yeah.
But for you, what was that transition like? Taking the next step, saying, you know what? I'm gonna do this. What was
Yeah.
that like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say that transition window there of going, okay, I was a youth pastor, I went to Bible college for this thing, and now I felt like that window of time, like that year after I left this gig as a youth pastor, was honestly like one of the harder years of life. And here's why, like this is sadly far too often the case where churches are amazing resources, places, spiritual sanctuaries on the weekends, but they're not always the best to work at. And this isn't universal. There's a lot of like amazing churches out there, but the guy that I was working for at the church I was at he's just not a great human, unfortunately, and just kind of a jerk to work for. And so it just kind of found me going, um, if I left this church and I went to a different church, like, is it going to be different somewhere else? I had a lot of friends from Bible college
Mm,
that I'd kind of compare notes with, and I was like, hey, I'm semi-miserable over here. What about you? Oh, you are too over there. Like, huh? Apparently, this is kind of a thread, you know. And again, this isn't universal. I'm still really involved in my own local church. We got a great pastor, but it just kind of caused me to question, like, all right, what do I really want to be doing? And so, as I was thinking on the speaking part of it, it did. I spent a lot of time wrestling with the question of going, okay, I went to Bible college. I thought I was going to be a youth pastor. Felt like I was called to ministry. So now, if I'm doing something tangential but different outside of the four walls of a church, am I being disobedient? Am I
mm.
going in a different direction? I didn't want to be Jonah running away from God and end up in the belly of a whale or something. And so I'm just, I had a hard time wrestling with that for a long time. Um, and even once I kind of landed on like, hey, I want to be a speaker, the majority of what I was doing as a speaker was not in the church world. It wasn't in the faith-based world. And so the majority of what I was doing was in high schools, it was in colleges, it was in student leadership conferences and events. It was in like the public sector. And so
Mm,
I didn't necessarily view myself as a Christian speaker, but more as a speaker who happened to be a Christian. And so
gotcha.
as a former youth pastor, there were certainly times where I'd go speak at like a school assembly, and I wouldn't like, in that type of like public school setting, you're not like, preaching or
Hmm.
quoting scripture or something. But sometimes I'd have students who'd come up and be like, "Have you ever been a youth pastor?" It was like, "Yeah, actually." I was like, I knew it. It's kind of like, you can't hide from it or something. I had a guy actually. This is funny. Yesterday, literally yesterday, the time this was recording, who I was talking to, and he's like, you know what, um, I could see like how you used to be a youth pastor, but you don't give that like awkward, weird youth pastor vibe. I was like, all right, I'll take that as a compliment, I guess. And so, but the point being is like, uh, it was just definitely like that year of going like, okay,
Hmm.
wife just had the first kid, left the youth pastor gig, trying to figure out what's next. If I go into this speaking thing, am I speaking in church? Am I speaking outside of church? Whatever I land on, am I doing ministry? And it was just a difficult, felt like wandering the desert, just trying to figure out, what's next, where do I go from here? But fast forwarding to today, like I still look back on that season of life as such a pivotal time of life that I'm glad kind of wandered through that to land on, what I'm doing today.
Mm. I appreciate your transparency, Grant, because the messy middle is what a lot
Yeah,
of
very.
us struggle with. They just see the, oh man, Grant Baldwin, he's got a company, he's an author, he's a speaker, he's equipping thousands of people, and then it's like, well, yeah, I had to get started somewhere. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, Grant, is you're pounding the pavement, you're speaking, you've got schools, universities, and then all of a sudden people start asking you about, hey, Grant, you're kind of doing this. Can you
Yeah.
start showing me? They say that feedback is a gift. That's one of the quotes out there. So how did you start to synthesize um, the questions and the requests that people like? Of course, you're still booking gigs, but how did you start to filter, like, you know what? I'm starting to get questions about this piece of speaking. I don't know, we'll get to the business of speaking later, but how did you start to synthesize that? Because I would imagine you've kind of on one side of the brain, you got to stay booked. And then on the other side, you got people requesting you for how can I learn about this? So how did you kind of work through that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there were a couple things that happened. One was, I'll tell you a story. When I was, I remember this was probably 11, 12 years ago or so, and speaking was going really well. I was doing a lot of gigs, and I found myself kind of like hitting a ceiling because the nature of speaking is it's a high paying manual labor job in that you get
Mm,
paid really well to stand on stage and run your mouth. But the nature of speaking is you got to get on a plane, you got to leave your family, you got to go somewhere, you got to go do the thing. It's like a
hmm.
surgeon. A surgeon makes really good money for what they do, but you got to go do surgery. So I felt like I didn't necessarily have a business. I had a job. It was a cool job. I loved it. It was a ton
Right.
of fun, but like nonetheless, it's a job. And so I just kind of felt like at this crossroads of going, in order to like increase your income or your impact, like you either have to like increase your fees, which in the youth market, I was kind of at the upper end of what I felt comfortable with, and or you just do more gigs, which is just again
Yeah.
going to require you to typically be gone more, so that wasn't real appealing either. I was already gone 80, 90 nights a year on the road. And like the 1 hour you're on stage or whatever it is like amazing. And the rest of the time you're just like, I just want to go home. I just want to sleep in my own bed tonight.
Yeah.
Um, and so I remember being at this kind of like pivotal time. And I remember I was speaking at an event in Reno, Nevada. And there's a friend of mine out in the area, a speaker friend of mine, mentor hero, who's probably 20 years older than me, a very successful speaker. And so I met up with him at Lake Tahoe. And he and I are driving around the lake there, just talking about life. And I remember him giving a really good piece of advice. He told me two things. He said, one is you have to regularly find things where the challenge exceeds the skill set, where the challenge exceeds the
Mm,
skill set. Meaning, like when you first start doing something, when I first started speaking, I felt like I was over my head, meaning like the challenge exceeds the skill set. I was like, holy crap, I don't know what
mm,
I'm doing. This is going to be a disaster. What's going to happen? But over time, what happens is it flips and the skill set exceeds the challenge. Meaning, I got to a
mm,
point where I could stand on stage in front of 1,000 teenagers and I could crush it, but inside kind of be on autopilot and just be bored.
mm.
And this isn't exclusive to just speaking. This is the case with anything. The first time
Yeah.
you start doing something, you're just like, I feel like I'm over my head. But over time, is it flips and you just get way more comfortable with that. And he said, part of the joy in work is you want to find things where the skill set or where the challenge exceeds the skill set, where you always just feel like I'm slightly over my head. And so at that point in my career, I felt a little bored. I felt a little restless. And so that was a really good piece of advice. But the second thing he told me is he said, Grant, a lot of people are feel like they're just born to be speakers. And he's one of those people. Like the guy's been speaking longer than I've been alive. He'll do his own eulogy. The guy loves to speak. And for me, like I genuinely enjoy speaking, but it also felt like not necessarily one of those things that like I got to do this forever.
Right.
And so he said, Grant, he said, I think you are an entrepreneur who happens to be good at speaking. And that really resonated with me. It just kind
Mm.
of like it clicked for me that, yeah, I genuinely enjoy speaking. But, if we fast forward to today, like I don't do nearly as much speaking as I used to. And I don't feel like I'm desperate to get on stage. I got to get back to it. I genuinely enjoy helping other speakers with their own, speaking business and making that impact and income. And so when I started having several people who were reaching out to me going, how do I do what you do? One, it was just kind of like you're just kind of paying attention to that. When you have a bunch of different people asking you a lot of the same
Mm.
questions, like, all right, there might be something that I don't, maybe it is, maybe there isn't, but something worth paying attention to. And then also at the time, again, this was 10, 12 years ago or so, there in my experience I didn't find anybody else who was teaching this. I kind of felt
Mm.
like the speaker lab kind of evolved out of like what I wish I had when I got started, because there's a lot of like kind of coaches and trainings on how do you put together a talk and how do you
Sure.
present a talk and skills on stage and PowerPoint presentations and those sorts of things, and like that's important. But at the same time it's like, man, if you're a phenomenal speaker but you don't know like how do you actually book a gig? Like how do you do
Hmm.
that part of it? And like how much do you charge? And who hires me? Who do I talk to? Like how does that part of it work? It felt like you had to be some best-selling author, or you had to be some pseudo celebrity, or you had to have like conquered cancer, or climbed Mount Everest, or won a gold medal, and then people would just naturally book you. It's like, yeah, but I'm like a white male from the Midwest who's had a normal average life. Like, there's nothing on paper where you be like, oh, well, of course that dude should be a speaker. And so it's just kind of like, but how do I get booked? How do I get paid? Like, how does that work? And so I figured out some things that I felt like worked well for me, and I started doing some coaching and training, and it felt like it was helping other speakers get similar results. I was like, I'd love that part. I want to be able to teach that part of it. And so that's kind of what evolved there. And so it was never like man, I'm doing, 60, 70 paid gigs a year. And then I get a couple people who ask me, a couple questions like, all right, I'm done with my own speaking stuff. Let's, put a bow on that. And we're going to quit that on Friday. And on Monday, we're going all in on coaching or teaching or whatever. I was like, it was never like that. It was just kind of like, hey, let's start doing some more coaching training. As that continued to ramp up, then it was like, all right, instead of doing
Mm.
70 gigs, let's do 50 gigs. Instead of doing 50 gigs, let's do 40 gigs. And it's just kind of like over time, they're kind of flip-flopping there to now, like I mentioned, I do very, very little speaking, and the majority of
Hmm.
my time is spent focused on the speaker lab.
Mm. Grant, you dropped several nuggets of wisdom there. An entrepreneur, Grant, I think you're an entrepreneur who speaks. I can understand how in that moment that was a light bulb aha
Yeah.
revelation, as we would say in the faith-based
Yeah, yeah.
world. Uh, Grant, let's talk about some of the tools and resources and how you go about helping students. So we kind of talked about this earlier. There's kind of like the art of speaking,
Hmm.
putting together a talk, voice inflection,
Yeah, yeah.
work in the audience, but then there's the business of speaking. And so I know you have a program, you've got a book, and then you've got the podcast. So let's start
Yeah.
with the program that students can enroll in, where you kind of provide a framework and a lot of other tools that kind of marry both the art and the science and the metrics and the data. So let's talk about the
Yeah.
program, and then we'll get into the book and the podcast.
Yeah, and actually we can kind of combine all three of them together because
Sure, that works too.
there's significant overlap and kind of a Venn diagram there. And so the podcast was kind of birthed out of a lot of people were asking questions, and so it's kind of like if you were to ask me like Grant, what should I charge as a speaker? Well, I can give you
Hmm.
a quick couple minute answer here, but at the same time there's a lot of nuance that goes into it. So it's like, what if we record an episode that's a 30-minute episode going in depth on speaking fees. And then also there's a lot of like speaker friends and people in the industry that I wanted to talk to. And so we've been doing the podcast for 9 years at this point. We've got
Wow.
530, 540 some episodes. And basically, it's called the Speaker Lab podcast. And so if you listen to this podcast, you probably listen to other podcasts. So definitely check that out. And then had the book come out called The Successful Speaker: 5 Steps for Booking Gigs, Getting Paid, and Building Your Platform. And then also we have a in-depth coaching and training program at the Speaker Lab, where if you want more help and support one-on-one and group level, that's the case. But I start with like the podcast and the book because like you don't have to spend anything with us. You can listen to literally hundreds of hours of the podcast, and you're going to
Hmm.
get a ton of information and a ton of knowledge there. Or you got a $10, $20 book that you can get that's going to give you a ton of information. But the core framework that we teach at the Speaker Lab, and this is in the podcast, this is in the book, this is in our programs, is what we call the Speaker Success Roadmap. And it makes the acronym SPEAK, SPEAK. And so maybe what we do is just I can go over it at a high level, and then we can kind of poke around wherever you want. But
Yeah, yeah, I'd love to do
yeah,
that.
to start with, as kind of a foundational piece, the S is select a problem to solve. Select a problem to
Mm.
solve, meaning like there's two things that every speaker needs to be clear on, and that is who you speak to and what problem you solve for that audience. Now, the dangerous thing here and the mistake that a lot of speakers make is we tend to spread the net as far and wide as possible. So, who do I speak
Hmm.
to? I don't know, man. I speak to humans. I speak to people. My message is for everybody. And what do I speak about? I don't know. What do you want me to speak about? We could talk about business or faith or family or sports or leadership or customer service or sales or like on and on and on the list goes. And the reality is like you don't want to be try to become like all things to all people because that's just very ineffective from a business standpoint. And so the like one thing we tell speakers is you want to be the steakhouse and not the buffet. The steakhouse, not the buffet.
Mm.
Meaning, like Jason, if you and I are going out to eat, we're looking for a good steak. Like we have a choice. We could go to a buffet where steak is one
Hmm.
of 100 things that they offer, and they're all mediocre, or we could go to a steakhouse where they just do one thing, but they do that one
Yeah.
thing really, really well. And so it's counterintuitive because again, speakers think like I got to spread the net as far and wide as possible. I want to speak to as many
Hmm.
types of people about as many topics as possible. It's like that's not what event planners, decision makers are looking for.
Yeah.
So the foundational piece again on S is selecting a problem to solve. The second part there, P, is to prepare your talk. Be really, really clear on who you speak to, and then how you're going to deliver that presentation. Are you doing workshops or keynotes or breakouts or seminars or webinars? how are you going to actually present that in a compelling and meaningful way that's going to be applicable and relevant to that audience. The E is to establish yourself as the expert. Establish yourself as the expert. So two key marketing assets that we tell speakers that you need a website and a demo video. So in
Mm.
this day and age, if you don't have a website, it's hard for people to take you seriously. And then a demo video is basically like it's almost like a movie trailer, So before any
Yeah.
of us would go see a movie, we want to see a trailer, and they're going to take a 90-minute, 2 hour movie. They're going to boil it down to 2 or 3 minutes. And within that 2 or 3 minutes, you're going to have an idea of who's in it, what's the theme, what's the plot, what's the genre. And the goal of the movie trailer and the goal of the demo video is to make people want to see more. And so that demo video is critically important as well. And then the next one, A, is to acquire paid speaking gigs. Now, this is the part that we want to fast forward to. Like, bro, just tell me how to get gigs. But we got to have these other pieces in place first. Otherwise, like, who do I speak to? I speak to anybody and everybody about everything. I'm just trying to book gigs. Like, no, 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 that doesn't work. We got to get clear on something here of who we speak to and what that problem is. But whenever it comes to acquiring paid speaking gigs, at this stage, we're not trying to, the mistakes speakers will make is going like, I got my website, I got my video, and now I just sit back and I wait for the phone to ring. And like, that doesn't work. Like, just because you have a
Hmm.
website, nobody cares. Like, your mom is thrilled and she'll tell both of her friends, nobody else is interested. And so at this point, we got to be much more proactive rather than reactive and like putting it out into the world, identifying decision makers, contacting them directly, starting conversations. And that's a big thing that we teach at the Speaker Lab. And then the last part of the process is K is knowing when to scale, meaning a lot of people who are interested in speaking ultimately would say like, hey, I have a message that I want to share. And speaking is a way to go about doing that. But a lot of speakers also say, hey, I want to do a book and I want to do a podcast and I want to do coaching and training and a course and consulting. And that's fine. You can do all those things, but you can't do all those things at once. So
Yeah.
you got to be clear on like how does speaking kind of fit into the mix of what it is that you're wanting to do in order to share a message. So again, I know I covered a lot there, but that's kind of the high level overview of what we teach in terms of like the speaker success roadmap in terms of getting booked and paid to speak.
No, that's perfect, Grant. Just from a location perspective, so where can people get a copy of the book? How can they subscribe and listen to the podcast, which I highly encourage. I've listened to it multiple episodes to Grant's point. And then if they want to enroll into your program, where can they go to find all three of those?
Yeah, yeah. So the book is you can find it on Amazon or our website. The Successful Speaker is the name of the book, and there's a Kindle and Audible version of that. The podcast is the Speaker Lab podcast. Again, the Speaker Lab podcast. So again, wherever you're listening to this, you can do a search for that, the Speaker Lab podcast. And then in terms of our programs, honestly, tell you what, if you're interested, just shoot me an email, grant@thespeakerlab.com, grant@thespeakerlab.com. I'm happy to connect you with our team, who can give you some more details. But yeah, if there's any questions or things I can do to help support people, I'm happy to do so.
Love it, folks. You heard it from the man himself. Grant, this has been awesome. Before we get ready to go, as you think about 2025, I know people, they do goal planning, New Year's resolutions, all these different things. What are you excited about for 2025? Is there any new projects or initiatives, or maybe it's something with your family that you're looking forward to, but what would that be for 2025 for you?
Yeah, I mean on the business front, we've got a couple irons in the fire right now within the company. There's no shortage of people who are interested in speaking, and again, a lot of people who were where I was 20 years ago, just going like, I think I can do this. I just wish someone would tell me what to do and how to do it. And
Mm-hmm.
speaking is one of those things that is a very aspirational thing. A lot of people are interested in, and it's just regardless of what happens with technology or AI or whatever, like it's not going away. That's sort of there's that
Yeah.
innate thing within us of connecting with other humans and learning from the other people that was put there by our creator. And so that's a real need that will forever be there. So uh, continually figuring out like how do we best serve and support students, how do we help students get the fastest possible results and make the kind of impact that they desire, is something we're working on a lot in 2025. On the personal front, I'm married to my high school sweetheart. We're coming up on our 23rd wedding anniversary. We've been together 28
Wow.
years. And
It's awesome.
like you and I were talking beforehand, we got three daughters, and so it's me and a house full of ladies. It's the best. And so I mean, I love being an entrepreneur. I love being a speaker. Those things are lovely, but it's way more important to me to be a good husband, to be a good father. So, we're currently planning a couple trips right now with the girls and intentional about making memories with them and quality time with them. Our oldest just started college, and so supporting her in that. So, yeah, it's way more important to me to just be a good husband, be a good father. That's the stuff that ultimately really matters.
That's awesome, Grant. I love it. Well, folks, that's all we've got time for today. Just huge shout out, Grant. Thank you for coming on the show. You've definitely imparted wisdom and given clear. And folks, we'll have all Grant's information in the show notes, his email, Speaker Lab podcast, which make sure you subscribe, leave. I promise you, when you listen, you'll want to leave a good review as well. But we'll have the book, the podcast, as well as his program, website, email, all that. But Grant, can't thank you enough for stopping by here on the Fortified Life.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it, man.
All right, everybody, that's all we've got time for today. But you know how we leave things. Don't compartmentalize your faith in the marketplace. And from the boardroom to the bathroom, God is with you. We'll see you next time on the Fortified Life podcast.